In a world that prides itself on progress, the wheels of injustice still turn quietly, grinding down those who dare to defy expectations. The bias isn't always loud or blatant. Sometimes it wears a uniform, greets you with a strained smile, or questions your worth with a glance. For Maya Jennings, success was not just about business. It was a challenge to the barriers constructed long before her time. She had shattered glass ceilings and torn through stereotypes, yet the subtle sting of prejudice remained a constant companion. Tonight, on a train speeding toward San Francisco, Maya would face one of those moments, a moment where dignity, honest identity, and courage would be tested. It was just a seat in first class, but it symbolized so much more. What happened in the hushed corridors of that train car would not only shake her world, but also force an entire system to confront the truth. Because some battles are fought not with fists or fury, but with resilience and resolve. And sometimes one person's defiance can change everything. The chill of the October night hung in the air as Maya Jennings stepped onto the platform of Seattle's Union Station. The rhythmic clatter of train wheels echoed in the distance. She pulled her tailored black coat tighter around her shoulders, her fingers grazing the handle of her sleek, charcoal gray suitcase. The exhaustion of the day pressed on her, yet her hazel eyes shone with determination. Maya's footsteps were confident, but measured as she walked toward the gleaming Amtrak high-speed train bound for San Francisco. Her presence was understated, an elegant blend of simplicity and authority. The city lights reflected off the sleek metal of the train, and for a fleeting moment, Maya allowed herself to admire the glow. Tomorrow was critical, a make-or-break meeting with international partners that could elevate her renewable energy company to new heights. She boarded the train, her heels tapping softly against the polished floors. The first-class cabin exuded quiet luxury. Plush leather seats, ambient lighting, and the muted hum of conversation created an atmosphere of exclusivity. Maya breathed deeply, savoring a moment of calm before the storm of negotiations awaiting her. As she settled into seat 3A, she opened her laptop and began reviewing her presentation slides. Graphs and bullet points flashed before her eyes, but her mind was sharper than ever. Her company, GreenTech Horizons, had come a long way from its modest beginnings. Each data point on her screen represented hours of sweat, setbacks, and small victories. Maya smiled faintly, the weight of her achievements settling on her shoulders like a mantle she was proud to wear. She barely noticed the faint shadow that passed across her aisle until it stopped. When she looked up, she met the scrutinizing eyes of Jessica Monroe, the first-class train attendant. Jessica's uniform was immaculate, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, and her smile was as brittle as glass. "Good evening, ma'am," Jessica said, her tone clipped. Her eyes scanned Maya's face, her dark skin, and her modest attire. A tailored suit that spoke of function rather than fashion. "Can I see your ticket, please?" Maya handed over her digital ticket with a practiced smile. Jessica took the tablet, but her eyes lingered on Maya a beat too long. The silence stretched, a subtle tension threading the air. "First class isn't for those who don't know their place," Jessica muttered under her breath, just loud enough for Maya to hear. Maya's jaw tightened, the words slicing through her composure like a blade. But she held her gaze steady, refusing to flinch. "I assure you, I'm in the right place," Maya said, her voice even and calm. Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly. Without another word, she handed the tablet back, her fingers brushing Maya's with a cool indifference. She turned away, her posture stiff, but the judgment hung in the air like smoke. Maya took a steadying breath, forcing her attention back to her laptop. But the moment of peace had shattered. The data on the screen blurred as Jessica's words echoed in her mind. 5 minutes later, the low murmur of the train's departure announcement barely registered as Maya tried to refocus. She knew better than to let a single slight derail her confidence, yet a cold knot of frustration settled in her stomach. After all her years of success, these moments still found her. The sound of approaching footsteps jarred her out of her thoughts. She looked up to see Paul Harrington, the train conductor, looming in the aisle. His navy blue uniform seemed to emphasize his broad shoulders and imposing stature. His gray eyes were hard, his jaw set in a line that suggested he rarely smiled. "Ma'am," Paul said, his voice cold and professional, "there seems to be an issue with your seating. Can I see your ticket again?" Maya's fingers curled around the tablet, a surge of irritation rising. She handed it over once more, her eyes never leaving Paul's face. He barely glanced at the screen before handing it back. "First class," he said slowly, as though the words tasted bitter. "Someone like you doesn't usually sit here. Are you sure there hasn't been some mistake?" The words fell heavily, a gavel pounding down on her dignity. Maya's spine stiffened. "I'm quite sure," she said, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. "I purchased this ticket legally. I belong here just as much as anyone else." A few passengers had begun to watch, their eyes flitting between Maya and Paul, like spectators at a trial. The silence in the cabin grew thick, the air taut with unspoken words. Paul's lips curled into a smirk. "You may say that, but typically the people in this class are different." He let the implication hang. Maya's heart hammered, but she refused to look away. "Are you judging me by my appearance or my skin color, Mr. Harrington?" she asked, her voice unwavering. Paul's eyes flashed, and for a moment he looked taken aback by her directness. But the moment passed, and his expression hardened. "If you don't cooperate," he said, his tone edged with threat, "I'll have security escort you out." The words, "people like you shouldn't be here," were unspoken, but unmistakable. Maya's fists clenched, her pulse roaring in her ears. She had faced these battles before, in boardrooms and conferences, in polite conversations laced with poison. But this public humiliation was something she would not tolerate. She lifted her chin, her gaze fierce. "You're violating my rights. I will not leave my seat because you think I don't belong." Paul's jaw tightened. The challenge hung between them, crackling like electricity. As the tension mounted, a voice from the back of the cabin cut through the silence. "Excuse me," said a calm, firm voice. All eyes turned to see Walter Evans, a distinguished older man with silver hair and a quiet authority. "I can't just sit here and watch this." Paul's eyes narrowed, his authority suddenly questioned. Maya's heart swelled with a surge of unexpected hope. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, she wasn't fighting alone. The train swayed gently as it hurtled through the dark Pacific Northwest night, the hum of the rails filling the cabin. Maya Jennings sat frozen in her seat, her hands clasped tightly on her lap. She could feel the weight of Paul Harrington's lingering glare even after he had stepped aside, muttering something unintelligible under his breath. Her resolve had not wavered, but her heart pounded furiously against her ribs. Around her, the first-class cabin was unnervingly silent. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their gazes darting between her and the aisle. Others stared intently at their phones or laptops, pretending not to notice. The air was thick with unspoken judgment, or perhaps fear. Maya couldn't decide which was worse. Then came the voice, deep, steady, and unyielding. "Excuse me," the man said, standing from his seat near the back of the cabin. His silver hair gleamed under the soft lighting, and his tailored navy blazer exuded an understated elegance. He adjusted his glasses as he stepped into the aisle, his eyes sharp and focused on Paul Harrington. "I can't sit here and watch this any longer." Maya turned, her heart skipping a beat. The man's presence carried an undeniable authority, and she recognized it immediately. This was someone who knew the weight of his words. "And you are." Paul's tone was a mix of irritation and defiance, though the man's composed demeanor gave him pause. "Walter Evans," the man replied, extending a hand that Paul hesitated to shake. "Retired attorney. And if I'm not mistaken, what I just witnessed was a clear example of discrimination." Paul's jaw tightened. He crossed his arms over his chest, his expression hardening. "Sir, I suggest you stay out of this. This is a matter of enforcing our first-class standards." Walter raised an eyebrow, his calm expression unshaken. "I've traveled first class many times, Mr. Harrington, and I've never seen anyone questioned like this, not without cause. So I have to ask, what exactly about this passenger made you think she doesn't belong here?" The cabin fell deathly silent. Maya's chest tightened as the words she'd been holding back threatened to spill over. She glanced at Walter, her eyes meeting his briefly. His gaze was steady, reassuring. Paul shifted on his feet, the discomfort visible in his stance. "I don't need to explain myself to you," he said finally. "This is company policy." Walter's voice remained calm, though his words grew sharper. "Then perhaps you can explain it to me as a lawyer, or better yet, to the press, because I'm sure they'd be very interested in hearing how Amtrak enforces its policies." A ripple of unease spread through the cabin. Passengers who had been pretending not to listen now turned their attention fully to the confrontation. A middle-aged woman, in a beige cardigan, leaned forward in her seat, her brow furrowed with concern. A man in a business suit adjusted his tie nervously. Paul's face darkened, but before he could respond, Jessica Monroe appeared at his side. She looked visibly shaken, her earlier smugness replaced with uncertainty. She glanced between Paul and Walter, then at Maya, who remained seated, her expression resolute. "Is there a problem here?" Jessica asked, her voice faltering. "Yes," Walter said simply. "The problem is your treatment of this passenger. I suggest you both apologize and let her be." Jessica blinked, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Paul, however, bristled. He stepped closer to Maya, looming over her. "Look," he said, his tone low and cold. "You might have your ticket, but that doesn't mean you belong here. And if you want to stay, you'll need to show some respect." The words hit like a slap. Maya's fingers tightened around the edge of her laptop, her knuckles turning white. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She wouldn't let them see her break. "I'm showing you respect by sitting here quietly in the seat I paid for," Maya said, her voice measured but firm. "I expect the same courtesy in return." Walter stepped forward, placing himself between Paul and Maya. "Enough," he said sharply. "You're out of line, Mr. Harrington. If you continue this, I'll ensure there are consequences." Paul stared at him, his jaw clenching and unclenching, as though he were weighing his options. Finally, he straightened, his face a mask of barely concealed rage. "Fine," Paul said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But don't think this is over." With that, he turned and stalked down the aisle, Jessica trailing behind him like a shadow. The tension in the cabin seemed to release all at once, passengers exhaling quietly as they exchanged uneasy glances. Walter turned back to Maya, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "Thank you," Maya said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the train. Walter nodded. You shouldn't have to fight this alone. As the train hurtled through the night, Maya tried to refocus on her work, but the confrontation played on a loop in her mind. Every word, every glare, every subtle implication of unworthiness. It all felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. Across the aisle, Walter watched her with quiet concern. He finally broke the silence. "Miss Jennings, may I ask you something?" Maya looked up, surprised. "Of course." "What you did back there," Walter said, his tone thoughtful. "Standing your ground. It's not easy. Have you faced this kind of thing before?" Maya hesitated, then nodded. "More times than I can count. It's just part of the reality for someone like me." Walter frowned. "It shouldn't be." "No," Maya agreed, her voice tinged with sadness. "But it is." They fell into silence, the rhythmic sound of the train filling the space between them. Maya felt a flicker of gratitude for Walter's presence, even as the sting of the confrontation lingered. The train slowed briefly at a rural station, the dim lights of the platform casting long shadows. Paul stood near the door of the first-class cabin, speaking in hushed tones with Jessica. Maya couldn't hear their words, but their expressions were clear: frustration, defiance, and something else: determination. As the train began to move again, Paul glanced over his shoulder, his eyes locking onto Maya, with a look that sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't over. The train sped through the night, a sleek bullet slicing the dark fabric of the Pacific Northwest. Inside the first-class cabin, the air was still thick with the aftertaste of confrontation. The hum of the train beneath her feet was steady, but Maya Jennings' heart was anything but. Each thud in her chest seemed to echo the words Paul Harrington had thrown at her, words that lingered like stubborn shadows. "People like you shouldn't be here." The insult was sharp, a rusty blade that cut deeper each time it replayed in her mind. She'd heard those words, or variations of them, before. In meetings, in hallways, in places where her competence should have been the only thing that mattered. Yet, here they were again, cloaked in the formality of first-class expectations. Maya's eyes drifted to the window, the blur of trees and small towns speeding past. The reflection staring back at her was composed, but beneath that surface lay a reservoir of pain and determination. Her fingers tapped lightly on the laptop keyboard, but her mind was far from the presentation she was supposed to be perfecting. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels became a soundtrack to memories she rarely let surface. She thought back to her early days as a fledgling entrepreneur, fresh out of MIT. Bright-eyed, ambitious, and believing that the world would judge her by her ideas and hard work. She remembered her first pitch meeting for Greentech Horizons, where she had stood in front of a room full of investors, older men in tailored suits, their eyes glazed with skepticism before she even opened her mouth. One of them had leaned back, his smirk a barely concealed sneer. "An energy company? That's ambitious. Are you sure you're not reaching above your station?" That had been the first cut. There had been many more since. She clenched her jaw, shoving the memory back into its box. Those experiences had shaped her, yes, but they did not define her. Each slight, each moment of prejudice had been a stepping stone, a lesson in perseverance. Her success hadn't been in spite of those moments, but because she refused to let them break her. And she wouldn't let this break her either. Maya took a deep breath and closed her laptop. The numbers, the projections, the carefully crafted slides, they all blurred together. What was the point of all this preparation if she couldn't even sit in a train car without her legitimacy being questioned? Her eyes roamed the cabin. The other passengers had returned to their own business, though their eyes flickered to her when they thought she wasn't looking. They were processing what had happened, each in their own way. A woman with a pearl necklace glanced away hurriedly, when Maya's gaze met hers. A young man in a crisp blazer gave her a quick, apologetic smile before burying his nose in his tablet. They saw her. They saw the injustice. But they did nothing. Maya sighed and leaned back against the plush leather seat. Her shoulders ached, as though the weight of the world was pressing down on them. This wasn't just about her. This was about every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. Every person who had been told, implicitly or explicitly, to know their place. Her mind flashed to her team back in San Francisco. They were counting on her. The deal she was chasing wasn't just a notch on her belt. It was the future of her company, the livelihoods of dozens of employees who had trusted her vision. Failure wasn't an option. A faint shuffle of footsteps pulled her out of her thoughts. She looked up to see Jessica Monroe, hovering near the service station at the front of the cabin, whispering into a small walkie-talkie. Her eyes flicked to Maya every few seconds, her lips tight and pale. Maya's stomach twisted. The confrontation earlier had simmered down, but the hostility hadn't evaporated. It had merely gone underground, a current running just below the surface. Jessica finished her hushed conversation and disappeared through the sliding door leading to the crew compartment. Maya exhaled slowly, her instincts tingling. Something was coming. She could feel it. She glanced at Walter Evans, who had returned to his seat. He caught her eye and gave a subtle nod, a silent message that said, "I've got your back." It was a small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. The sliding door at the front of the cabin opened again. Paul Harrington returned, his face set like stone. He walked down the aisle, his boots thudding with deliberate weight, stopping just short of Maya's seat. "Miss Jennings," he said, his voice carefully controlled, though a sneer curled at the edges. "We need to have a word." Maya looked up, her expression neutral. "I believe we've already said enough." He didn't flinch. "I've spoken with the higher-ups. They've given me the discretion to handle this situation as I see fit." Her jaw tightened. "And how do you see fit?" Paul leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I could call security right now. Have you removed for disrupting the peace? You might think you're making a stand, but all you're doing is making trouble." Maya's heart pounded, a fiery defiance flaring in her chest. She met his gaze, unblinking. "I'm not the one causing trouble. You are." His eyes narrowed. "Careful, Miss Jennings. Your defiance could cost you more than a seat." A chill ran down her spine, but she refused to let it show. "Are you threatening me?" He straightened, his smile thin and humorless. "Just a word of advice. Know your place." The phrase landed like a slap. Maya felt her cheeks burn, but her voice remained steady. "I do. Know my place? It's right here." Paul's eyes flashed with anger, but he didn't respond. He turned abruptly and stalked away, the tension in the air thickening with each step he took. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she picked up her water bottle. She took a slow sip, forcing herself to breathe deeply, to steady her racing heart. Walter's voice broke the silence. "You're stronger than most people I know," he said quietly. Maya managed a small, tight smile. "I've had a lot of practice." He nodded. "Keep holding on. They want you to break. Don't give them the satisfaction." "I won't," she said, her voice a whisper of steel. But as the train continued its relentless journey toward San Francisco, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The wheels screeched softly as the high-speed train glided into San Francisco's Union Station. The grand old building, with its arched windows and wrought iron fixtures, was shrouded in the quiet solemnity of the midnight hour. The once bustling platform was now a ghostly expanse of shadows and muted echoes. Maya Jennings stepped onto the platform, her polished black heels clicking against the cold concrete. Her suitcase trailed behind her like a weary companion, its wheels rolling over the uneven surface. The sharp autumn air bit at her cheeks, but the chill inside her was colder. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. The confrontation on the train still pulsed in her veins, every word etched into her memory like scars she couldn't erase. Know your place. The words lingered, dripping with condescension, a reminder that for some people, no achievement would ever be enough. She opened her eyes, her gaze steely, and whispered to herself, I refuse to let them define me. The station clock above her head read 12:07 a.m. The meeting she was supposed to attend had started 7 minutes ago. Anxiety clawed at her chest, a relentless drumbeat reminding her that time was slipping through her fingers. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers cold and clumsy. A flood of notifications filled the screen. 12 missed calls from her assistant, Rachel. 4 messages marked urgent. One message stood out, the words stark and ominous. The partner is waiting. They're getting frustrated. Maya's stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't just any meeting. It was the meeting. A chance to secure a multi-million-dollar deal with Novacore International, a conglomerate with the power to launch her company, Green Tech Horizons, onto the global stage. Months of preparation, sleepless nights, and relentless work had led to this moment, and she was late. Maya's heels clicked faster as she moved through the station, searching for a quiet spot to join the video call. Her breath fogged in the cold air, matching the panic that fogged her mind. She found a corner near a worn-out bench, dropped her suitcase, and opened her laptop with trembling hands. The screen flickered to life, illuminating her face in harsh, unforgiving light. She clicked on the meeting link, praying the connection would hold. Rachel's face appeared first, her eyes wide with concern. Maya, where have you been? They're losing patience? I got held up, Maya said, her voice tight. I'm here now. Let's do this. Rachel nodded, but her face was etched with doubt. Okay, I'll patch you in. The screen shifted, and the image of Richard Voss, Novacore's senior partner, filled the display. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his sharp blue eyes glinting with irritation. The backdrop behind him was a sleek, modern conference room, a stark contrast to Maya's dimly lit corner of the train station. Maya, Richard said, his voice clipped. You're late. I apologize, Maya replied, keeping her tone steady. There was an issue with my travel, but I'm ready now. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. An issue with your travel? We expect professionalism, Maya. These are high-stakes discussions. I understand, she said, trying to steady her breathing. Let's begin. Maya launched into her pitch, her voice confident, her words precise. She knew this presentation by heart, every slide, every statistic. But as she spoke, the connection crackled, the audio cutting in and out. As you can see, Green Tech Horizons has static potential to revolutionize. Richard's frown deepened. Maya, your connection is terrible. This is unacceptable. She clenched her fists, panic rising. Give me one moment, she said, her voice trembling. She switched to her phone's hotspot, praying it would stabilize the connection. The screen froze, then flickered back to life. Richard's expression had hardened into stone. Maya, he said, his tone cold. If you can't manage a simple video call, how can we trust you to manage a global partnership? Her heart sank. Please, let me finish. No, Richard interrupted. We've heard enough. We need reliability, and clearly you're not ready for this level of commitment." His words felt like a punch to the gut. Maya's mouth opened, but no sound came out. A cold dread seeped into her bones. "We'll be in touch," Richard said curtly. And the screen went black. The silence that followed was suffocating. Maya stared at the dark screen, her hands trembling. The deal was gone. The opportunity she had fought so hard for, sacrificed so much for, had slipped through her fingers like sand. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She felt the eyes of the station's few remaining souls on her. A janitor sweeping in the corner, a man asleep on a bench, a young woman waiting for a late train. None of them knew what had just happened, but Maya felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly defeated. The cold concrete bench beneath her seemed to solidify the weight of her failure. She bowed her head, her shoulders shaking. Maya sat there, the chill seeping into her bones. The injustice of it all gnawed at her. The confrontation on the train had been more than just an insult. It had been a derailment, a calculated attempt to undermine her confidence, her legitimacy, and it had worked. She thought of her team back in San Francisco, the engineers, the marketers, the young interns who had placed their hopes in her leadership. She thought of the late nights spent perfecting every detail of this partnership, the dreams of expanding their technology to communities that needed it most. All of it, too, had been jeopardized because of prejudice, because someone decided she didn't belong. A surge of anger flared in her chest, hot and consuming. She clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms. This wasn't just a loss. It was a theft. They had stolen her time, her dignity, her opportunity. And if she didn't fight back, they would keep stealing from her and from others. She straightened, lifting her chin. The flame of defiance in her eyes burned brighter than ever. Her phone buzzed in her hand. A message from Rachel. "We'll find another way. We believe in you." Maya's eyes stung, but she blinked away the tears. She would not let this defeat define her. There were other doors to open, other battles to fight, and she would fight them, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. She stood, her legs steady beneath her. The cold air whipped around her, but she barely felt it. She walked out of the station, her mind already forming a plan. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The skyscrapers of San Francisco shimmered like cold sentinels in the early morning light, their windows reflecting the hues of a city waking up to another day. From her office on the 42nd floor of the Green Tech Horizons building, Maya Jennings stared out at the sprawling city below, her mind clouded with exhaustion and frustration. The confrontation on the train, the disastrous meeting with Novacor, and the haunting words, "People like you shouldn't be here," played on a loop in her mind. A hollow ache spread in her chest. But beneath that ache, something stronger had taken root. A hardened resolve. She couldn't let this slide. Not this time. Maya turned back to her desk, where her laptop sat open. The screen was filled with data, reports, and emails that blurred together. Her assistant, Rachel, had left a fresh cup of coffee beside her keyboard, the steam curling up in delicate wisps. But even the caffeine couldn't lift the weight pressing down on her. She picked up her phone and dialed Rachel's extension. "Good morning, Maya." Rachel's voice was careful, tiptoeing around the aftermath of last night's disaster. "Morning, Rachel." Maya's voice was steady, betraying none of the storm inside her. "I need you to pull something for me." "Of course. What do you need?" "I want the most recent passenger complaint records from our transportation division. Specifically, I want any reports related to incidents of discrimination, mistreatment, or racial bias." Maya paused, her jaw tightening. "I want All of them. There was a slight hesitation on the other end. All of them? Yes, and send them to me as soon as possible. Understood, Maya, Rachel replied. I'll get right on it. Maya ended the call and took a deep breath, the cold air from the office vent prickling her skin. She knew there would be complaints. She wasn't naive. In an organization as large and far-reaching as Green Tech Horizons, incidents were inevitable. But what she had experienced on that train, what she had felt, wasn't just an isolated incident. It was systemic, and it was time to expose it. An hour later, her inbox pinged with a new message from Rachel. The subject line read, "Requested complaint reports, 6 months data." Maya clicked the email, and a spreadsheet opened, sprawling across her screen with an unsettling number of rows. She scrolled down, the sheer volume of complaints tightening the knot in her stomach. Row after row, the entries told stories that felt disturbingly familiar. Complaint number 5672. Attendant refused to assist me, claiming they were too busy. Helped others who arrived after me. Passenger, Priya Patel. Complaint number 5734. Conductor questioned my ticket, despite clear evidence, treated other passengers with more respect. Passenger, Jamal Thompson. Complaint number 5809. Denied entry to first class because I didn't look the part. Passenger, Elena Martinez. The names, the details. They all blended together into a cacophony of prejudice and pain. Each entry was a drop of water in a rising tide, a tide that threatened to drown everything Maya had worked so hard to build. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, a dull throb forming behind her eyes. She clicked into individual complaints, reading them one by one. The words burned, not because they were new, but because they were too familiar. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The weight of these stories felt personal. They mirrored her own experiences, her own battles, and they were happening under her watch, within her own company. A company she had built on the principles of innovation, sustainability, and equity. Had she been blind to this, or had she simply hoped that by succeeding she could erase these biases? A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Rachel stepped in, a tablet tucked under her arm. Her usually cheerful demeanor was muted, her eyes clouded with concern. "I pulled the data you asked for," Rachel said, her voice soft. "It's worse than we thought, isn't it?" Maya nodded, gesturing to the screen. "It's not just a few isolated incidents. It's a pattern, a deep, ugly pattern." Rachel shifted uncomfortably. "What are you going to do?" "Expose it." Maya's voice was steel. "We can't let this fester. If we do nothing, we're complicit." Rachel nodded, a spark of determination lighting in her eyes. "I'm with you. Whatever you need." "Thanks, Rachel," Maya said, her voice softening. "I need you to connect me with Elena Rivera and Michael Trent. We need to get ahead of this before it becomes something we can't control." "I'll set up a meeting for this afternoon," Rachel said. "Anything else?" Maya paused. "Yes. Get in touch with the legal department. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with." Rachel nodded and left, the door clicking shut behind her. Maya turned back to her screen, the rows of complaints staring back, like silent accusations. She knew this was going to be a fight, a messy, painful fight. But she was ready. As the sun climbed higher, Maya worked relentlessly, combing through the complaints, highlighting patterns, and annotating key details. A disturbing number of incidents involved the same names, Paul Harrington and Jessica Monroe. Her jaw clenched. It wasn't just about them, though. They were symptoms of a larger disease, a culture that allowed prejudice to thrive in the shadows. The intercom on her desk buzzed. Elena and Michael are here, Rachel's voice announced. Send them in. The door opened, and Elena Rivera, head of customer relations, walked in first. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a low bun, and her sharp eyes missed nothing. Behind her came Michael Trent, the company's legal advisor, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a quiet intensity. Thanks for coming, Maya said, gesturing to the chairs in front of her desk. Elena sat, her face serious. Rachel gave us a brief rundown. It doesn't look good. No, Maya agreed. It doesn't. Michael adjusted his glasses. If these complaints are accurate, we're looking at potential lawsuits, discrimination, violation of civil rights, hostile environments. It's a minefield. I'm not worried about lawsuits, Maya said, her voice firm. I'm worried about our integrity. This isn't just about protecting ourselves legally. It's about doing what's right. Elena nodded. So, what's the plan? Maya took a deep breath. We investigate, thoroughly. We compile the evidence, identify the culprits, and root out the culture that allowed this to happen. Michael's eyes narrowed. That won't be easy. Some people won't want to change. Then they can leave, Maya said, steel in her voice. We either stand for our values or we stand for nothing. Elena leaned forward, her eyes blazing. I'm with you, Maya. Whatever it takes. Michael nodded slowly. I'll do what I can to protect us legally. But brace yourself. This is going to get ugly. Maya's gaze hardened. I'm ready for ugly. What I'm not ready for is silence. As they began laying out the battle plan, Maya felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead was treacherous, but for the first time in days, she felt like she was moving toward justice. No matter how deep the rot went, she would dig it out. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound in the conference room as Maya Jennings stared at the documents spread out before her. The large wooden table, usually reserved for strategy sessions and celebratory meetings, was now a battlefield strewn with papers, reports, and printouts that painted a grim picture of her company's hidden reality. The blinds were drawn, filtering the early evening light into muted slashes across the carpeted floor. The weight of what she was about to undertake pressed on her shoulders, but Maya stood tall. This was a fight she could not, would not, back down from. Elena Rivera, her head of customer relations, sat to her right, a tablet in her hand, eyes flickering with determination. Michael Trent, her legal advisor, occupied the chair to her left, his fingers steepled in deep thought. Maya took a deep breath. We have a lot of ground to cover, and not much time to do it. Elena nodded, flipping her tablet around to show a detailed graph. We've identified a pattern. The incidents involving discrimination or mistreatment are disproportionately centered around a handful of employees. She tapped the screen, and several names appeared in red. Paul Harrington, Jessica Monroe, and a few others. Maya's stomach tightened. These are just the ones who have been reported, Elena continued. I suspect there are more incidents that have gone unrecorded. Michael leaned forward. Legally, this is a powder keg. If we don't address this quickly and thoroughly, we're looking at potential class action lawsuits, damage to the company's reputation, and, worst of all, betrayal of the values we claim to uphold. Maya's jaw clenched. We need to expose this fully. I want a complete investigation. Every department, every route, every complaint. We leave no stone unturned. Elena's eyes hardened. Agreed. We need to hear from the victims, the ones who were silenced, ignored, or dismissed. Michael hesitated. That could get messy. We're talking about bringing up painful memories for people. Some might not want to come forward. Maya's voice was firm. They deserve to be heard. We owe them that much. Maya stood up, her gaze sweeping the room. We're forming a task force. I want the best people on this. People who care about justice, not just their careers. Elena's fingers flew across her tablet. I have a list of employees who've expressed frustration with company culture or have shown initiative in diversity and inclusion efforts. Bring them in, Maya said. We need people who won't be afraid to ask hard questions. Rachel, Maya's assistant, entered the room with a knock. I've reached out to the employees on Elena's list. They're ready to meet with you tomorrow morning. Maya nodded. Good. Make sure they know this isn't just another corporate exercise. This is about changing the very fabric of who we are. Rachel's eyes shone with admiration. They know, Maya. They're ready. The next morning, the conference room was filled with an air of quiet resolve. The members of the task force, a diverse group of employees from different departments and backgrounds, sat around the table. Their faces reflected a mixture of determination and apprehension. Maya addressed them, her voice steady. Thank you all for being here. This isn't going to be easy. We're going to uncover things that will make us uncomfortable, maybe even ashamed. But we have to face them if we're going to change. She paused, scanning their faces. Our job is to listen to those who've been wronged, document their stories, and hold the guilty parties accountable. We're not here to protect the company's image. We're here to protect its soul. Amara Patel, a young data analyst, raised her hand. How do we encourage people to come forward? Some might be scared of retaliation. Michael spoke up. We'll guarantee anonymity where possible, and we'll establish a zero-tolerance policy for any retaliation. Maya nodded. I'll personally make sure of it. We need to rebuild trust, and that starts with showing that we're serious about protecting those who speak up. The task force split into teams, each assigned to interview affected employees and customers. The days that followed were a whirlwind of difficult conversations and harrowing revelations. Amara sat with a young black woman named Danielle Lewis, a former customer who had filed a complaint 6 months ago. Danielle's eyes were wary, her voice hesitant. I was on the train from Portland to Sacramento, Danielle said. I had a first-class ticket, but the attendant looked at me like I didn't belong. She kept asking if I was sure I was in the right car. When I insisted, she rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath. Amara's heart ached. Did anyone else witness it? Danielle nodded. There was a man across the aisle. He looked like he wanted to say something, but he stayed quiet. Do you remember the attendant's name? Danielle's lips tightened. Jessica Monroe. Amara's pen froze mid-scribble. The name was all too familiar by now. As the interviews piled up, a clear pattern emerged. The same names appeared over and over. Paul Harrington, Jessica Monroe, and a few others who seemed to operate with impunity. The testimonies painted a picture of a culture that tolerated bias, a culture that needed to be dismantled. Maya spent long nights poring over the reports, each story a thread in a tapestry of injustice. She felt the weight of each word, each experience. The pain was palpable, but so was the hope that this process was leading to real change. One evening, as Maya was reviewing the latest batch of interviews, her office door opened. Michael stood there, his face grave. We need to talk, he said, closing the door behind him. We've gathered enough evidence to take action, but it's going to get ugly. Paul and Jessica aren't going to go down quietly, and there are people in the company who will defend them. Maya's eyes narrowed. Let them. We're not backing down. Michael hesitated. Are you ready for the fallout? Maya's voice was ice. I'm ready for justice. As the weight of the evidence solidified, Maya felt the storm clouds gathering. The confrontation with Paul, Jessica, and the old guard of the company was inevitable. But she was no longer afraid. This was more than a battle for her company's future. It was a battle for its soul. The heavy clouds over San Francisco mirrored the growing tension inside GreenTech Horizons' boardroom. The glass walls, which usually let in bright rays of sunlight and panoramic views of the city skyline, now framed a somber scene. Gray skies and streaks of rain streamed down the glass like silent tears. Maya Jennings sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her fingers steepled, her gaze unwavering. In front of her were the senior executives, the top decision-makers of a company that was now at a crossroads. Their faces ranged from supportive to skeptical, with a few openly hostile. Elena Rivera sat to Maya's right, her eyes sharp and focused. Michael Trent was on her left, his legal pad filled with annotations. Rachel, her assistant, who stood discreetly near the door, ready to document everything. The air in the room was electric, charged with the kind of anticipation that came before a storm. Maya scanned the room, making eye contact with each person. These were the people she had trusted to uphold the company's values. Some had been with her since the early days. Others had joined during the company's rapid growth. Now, she wondered how many of them truly understood what was at stake. She cleared her throat, the sound slicing through the silence like a knife. "We're here today because our company has a problem," Maya began, her voice steady. "A deep, systemic problem that we can no longer ignore." She tapped the tablet in front of her, and the large screen on the wall came to life. Rows of complaint summaries filled the display, each line a scar of injustice. Priya Patel refused assistance despite repeated requests. Jamal Thompson, ticket validity questioned without cause. Elena Martinez, denied first-class entry based on appearance. The entries scrolled slowly, painfully, a procession of human pain reduced to digital records. Maya paused, allowing the weight of the words to sink in. "These are not isolated incidents," she continued. "These are patterns. Patterns that reveal a culture of prejudice, bias, and indifference. And these patterns are happening under our watch." A murmur rippled through the room. David Caldwell, the CFO, leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. "Maya," he said, his voice measured, "we've built a successful company. We've weathered challenges before. Are you sure this isn't being blown out of proportion?" Maya's jaw tightened. "I'm not blowing anything out of proportion, David. These are real people who have been mistreated. Our customers, our employees. This isn't just a PR issue. It's a moral failure." David shrugged. "Mistakes happen. We can't control every interaction. We can control how we respond to them." Maya shot back. "And so far, our response has been silence. That ends today." Linda Harris, the VP of Operations, folded her arms. "If we go public with this, it could damage our reputation. Our shareholders won't be happy." Maya's eyes blazed. "Our reputation is already damaged. We just don't see the cracks because we've been too focused on profit margins and quarterly reports." Linda's face flushed. "You're risking the stability of this company." "No," Maya said firmly. "I'm saving it." A tense silence settled over the room. Then, Marcus Johnson, the chief technology officer, leaned forward. His dark eyes glimmered with determination. "Maya's right," he said. "We built this company on the idea that innovation and integrity go hand in hand. If we ignore this, we're betraying everything we stand for." A few heads nodded in agreement. Sophia Lin, the director of marketing, spoke up. "Our customers trust us to lead with integrity. If we sweep this under the rug, that trust is gone forever." Maya felt a flicker of hope. "We have a choice. We can protect the status quo, or we can protect our values. I know which one I choose." She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what came next. "We're going to implement sweeping reforms," Maya declared. "A full-scale investigation, mandatory diversity training, and transparent accountability. And we're going to hold a public hearing. We need to confront this head-on." The room erupted in a cacophony of protests and murmurs. David Caldwell's voice cut through the noise. "A public hearing? That's suicide. You'll drag us all through the mud." "No," Maya said coldly. "I'm cleaning up the mud we've been standing in for far too long." She stood, her presence commanding the room. "This isn't a negotiation. You either support these reforms, or you step aside. There's no middle ground." The tension in the room was a living thing, heavy and oppressive. David's face was stone, his lips a thin line. Linda looked away, her jaw clenched. Elena's voice broke the silence. "Maya's right. If we don't fix this now, we'll lose more than our reputation. We'll lose our soul." Michael nodded. "Legally, this is our best option. Transparency and decisive action will protect us far more than denial and cover-ups." One by one, the executives began to nod, some reluctantly, others with conviction. David Caldwell's eyes met Maya's, and for a moment she thought he would refuse, but then he sighed, the fight draining from his shoulders. "All right," he said. "We do it your way." Maya exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling over her. "Thank you," she said. "We're going to need everyone's support to make this work." She turned to Rachel. "Set the date for the hearing, 2 weeks from now, and let the employees and customers know. They're invited to speak." Rachel nodded, scribbling notes. "I'll make sure the message is clear." Maya looked around the room, meeting each gaze with unwavering resolve. "This is our chance to show who we really are, to prove that we're not just another company chasing profits, but a company that stands for justice, integrity, and fairness." The room was silent, the weight of the decision sinking in. "We can't change the past," Maya said, her voice soft but firm. "But we can decide what kind of future we want to build." As the meeting adjourned, Maya felt a sense of grim satisfaction. The storm was coming, and the path ahead was fraught with challenges. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. She stepped to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked city below. The fight for justice had begun. The heavy clouds over San Francisco mirrored the growing tension inside GreenTech Horizon's boardroom. The glass walls, which usually let in bright rays of sunlight and panoramic views of the city skyline, now framed a somber scene. Gray skies and streaks of rain streamed down the glass, like silent tears. Maya Jennings sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her fingers steepled, her gaze unwavering. In front of her were the senior executives, the top decision-makers of a company that was now at a crossroads. Their faces ranged from supportive to skeptical, with a few openly hostile. Elena Rivera sat to Maya's right, her eyes sharp and focused. Michael Trent was on her left, his legal pad filled with annotations. Rachel, her assistant, who stood discreetly near the door, ready to document everything. The air in the room was electric, charged with the kind of anticipation that came before a storm. Maya scanned the room, making eye contact with each person. These were the people she had trusted to uphold the company's values. Some had been with her since the early days. Others had joined during the company's rapid growth. Now, she wondered how many of them truly understood what was at stake. She cleared her throat, the sound slicing through the silence like a knife. "We're here today because our company has a problem," Maya began, her voice steady. "A deep, systemic problem that we can no longer ignore." She tapped the tablet in front of her, and the large screen on the wall came to life. Rows of complaint summaries filled the display, each line a scar of injustice. Priya Patel refused assistance despite repeated requests. Jamal Thompson, ticket validity questioned without cause. Elena Martinez, denied first-class entry based on appearance. The entries scrolled slowly, painfully, a procession of human pain reduced to digital records. Maya paused, allowing the weight of the words to sink in. These are not isolated incidents, she continued. These are patterns. Patterns that reveal a culture of prejudice, bias, and indifference. And these patterns are happening under our watch. A murmur rippled through the room. David Caldwell, the CFO, leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. Maya, he said, his voice measured. We've built a successful company. We've weathered challenges before. Are you sure this isn't being blown out of proportion? Maya's jaw tightened. I'm not blowing anything out of proportion, David. These are real people who have been mistreated. Our customers, our employees. This isn't just a PR issue. It's a moral failure. David shrugged. Mistakes happen. We can't control every interaction. We can control how we respond to them. Maya shot back. And so far, our response has been silence. That ends today. Linda Harris, the VP of Operations, folded her arms. If we go public with this, it could damage our reputation. Our shareholders won't be happy. Maya's eyes blazed. Our reputation is already damaged. We just don't see the cracks because we've been too focused on profit margins and quarterly reports. Linda's face flushed. You're risking the stability of this company. No, Maya said firmly. I'm saving it. A tense silence settled over the room. Then, Marcus Johnson, the chief technology officer, leaned forward. His dark eyes glimmered with determination. Maya's right, he said. We built this company on the idea that innovation and integrity go hand in hand. If we ignore this, we're betraying everything we stand for. A few heads nodded in agreement. Sophia Lin, the director of marketing, spoke up. Our customers trust us to lead with integrity. If we sweep this under the rug, that trust is gone forever. Maya felt a flicker of hope. We have a choice. We can protect the status quo, or we can protect our values. I know which one I choose. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what came next. We're going to implement sweeping reforms, Maya declared. A full-scale investigation, mandatory diversity training, and transparent accountability. And we're going to hold a public hearing. We need to confront this head-on. Over the next several days, the conference room became a stage for courage. Each witness was brought in to rehearse their testimony, to refine their words, and to prepare for the scrutiny they would face. Danielle Lewis sat nervously in front of Maya, her hands clasped tightly together. Take your time, Maya said gently. Tell me what happened that day. Danielle took a deep breath. I had my ticket in hand, first class, but Jessica Monroe looked me up and down like I was some kind of intruder. She asked if I was sure I belonged there. When I insisted, she rolled her eyes and muttered something about people knowing their place. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. I felt like I was being stripped of my dignity, right there in front of everyone. Maya's heart clenched. You don't have to do this if you're not ready. Danielle shook her head. I need to do this. People need to know. Maya smiled, pride and sadness mingling in her chest. You're incredibly brave, Danielle. One by one, the witnesses rehearsed. Each story was a brick in the wall of evidence they were building. Each voice added weight to the truth they would reveal. As the preparations intensified, so did the pushback. Anonymous emails flooded Maya's inbox, some accusatory, some threatening. "You're going to ruin this company. Stop this witch hunt before it's too late. People like you don't belong at the top." Maya's hands shook as she read them, but her resolve solidified with each word. Fear was their weapon. Silence was their goal. But she would not be silent. David Caldwell, the CFO, stormed into her office one evening, his face flushed with anger. "This is getting out of control, Maya," he barked. "You're tearing this company apart." "No," Maya replied, her voice icy calm. "I'm putting it back together the right way." David's eyes narrowed. "You'll lose everything. Then, it's a price worth paying." He slammed the door on his way out, but the sound was nothing compared to the roaring determination in her heart. Late at night, when the office was dark and empty, the weight of it all would creep in. Maya would sit alone, the city lights twinkling beyond the glass, and wonder if she was doing the right thing. Doubt whispered in the silence. What if this destroys everything you've built? What if you fail? What if no one listens? But then she would think of Danielle, Jamal, Elena, and all the others. Their faces, their voices, their pain. And she would remember why she started this fight. Failure wasn't an option. Silence wasn't an option. The only way out was through. The night before the hearing, Maya gathered the task force one last time. The room buzzed with tension and anticipation. "We've done everything we can," she said, her voice firm. "Tomorrow, we speak the truth. And whatever happens, we stand together." Elena nodded. "We're ready." Michael adjusted his tie, a rare smile breaking through his serious demeanor. "Let's make history." As they filed out, Maya lingered for a moment, staring at the empty chairs, the stacks of evidence, and the screen displaying their carefully crafted presentation. The storm was here, and she was ready to face it. Maya took a deep breath, her eyes glinting with steely resolve. Tomorrow, the world would hear the truth, and nothing would ever be the same again. The sky over San Francisco was gray, heavy with the weight of an impending storm. It was as if the universe itself sensed the tension of the day ahead. The public hearing that Maya Jennings had fought so hard to organize was finally here. For 14 relentless days, the Green Tech Horizons team had prepared, pored over evidence, and rehearsed testimonies. Now, the truth was ready to come into the light. Maya stood in front of the mirror in her office, adjusting the collar of her navy blue blazer. The woman staring back at her looked poised, but behind her eyes was a swirling storm of determination, fear, and hope. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of the stakes. This was more than just a corporate issue. It was a reckoning, a chance to expose systemic prejudice, to right wrongs that had gone unaddressed for too long. A knock at the door broke her reflection. "Come in," Maya called, her voice even. Rachel entered, a nervous energy radiating from her. "The hearing room is packed, Maya. Media, employees, customers, everyone's here." Maya nodded. "Thank you, Rachel." Rachel hesitated. "You ready for this?" Maya's eyes narrowed with resolve. "I have to be." The hearing room was a sprawling hall on the ground floor of Green Tech Horizons headquarters, usually reserved for large conferences or celebratory gatherings. Today, it felt more like a courtroom. Rows of chairs were filled with employees, stakeholders, customers, and journalists. Cameras from local and national news stations were positioned around the room, lenses trained on the stage where the hearing panel sat. A hush settled over the crowd as Maya entered, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. Heads turned, eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity, support, and skepticism. She met their gazes head-on, refusing to let doubt creep into her stride. Elena Rivera and Michael Trent followed closely behind her, their presence a silent pillar of support. Maya took her seat at the central table. To her right sat the task force members, their faces a blend of nervousness and determination. To her left, the witnesses, employees, and customers who had stepped forward to share their stories. They looked resolute, though their eyes betrayed the weight of the moment. At the opposite end of the room, Paul Harrington and Jessica Monroe sat with their own legal representatives. Paul's face was cold, a mask of defiance. Jessica's eyes darted nervously around the room, her fingers twitching in her lap. The air was charged, the silence thick with anticipation. A voice crackled through the microphone. Judge Ethan Caldwell, a retired federal judge appointed to oversee the hearing, cleared his throat. "This hearing is now in session," he announced. "We are here to investigate allegations of systemic discrimination and misconduct within Green Tech Horizons. We will hear testimonies, review evidence, and determine the appropriate course of action." He turned his gaze to Maya. "Miss Jennings, you may begin." Maya stood, her palms flat on the table, her voice steady as she addressed the room. "Thank you, Your Honor. Today is not just about accountability. It's about justice. For too long, prejudice and bias have infected the culture of this company. What we uncover today may be painful, but the truth needs to be heard." She paused, letting her words settle. "To those who have suffered, we see you. To those who have inflicted harm, we will hold you accountable." Elena stood and approached the large screen beside the panel. With a tap on her tablet, she brought up a timeline of documented complaints. For the past 2 years, there has been a pattern of discriminatory behavior involving specific employees. Elena began, her voice clear and confident. "We will show evidence that these incidents are not isolated, but part of a larger issue of systemic bias." The screen displayed complaint summaries, names, dates, and details. Danielle Lewis, denied dignity by being questioned repeatedly in first class. Jamal Thompson, ticket questioned, treated with suspicion despite clear proof. Elena Martinez, humiliated and dismissed based on appearance. As each case flashed on the screen, a murmur swept through the crowd. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others exchanged knowing glances. Elena turned to Judge Caldwell. "We will now hear directly from those affected." The first witness to step forward was Danielle Lewis. She approached the microphone, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted. The room was silent as she adjusted the microphone. "Tell us what happened to you, Ms. Lewis," Elena prompted gently. Danielle took a steadying breath. "I was traveling from Portland to Sacramento. I had a first-class ticket. When I boarded the train, Jessica Monroe looked me up and down, as if I didn't belong. She asked me repeatedly if I was in the right place." Jessica's face went pale, her eyes fixed on the table. I tried to explain, but she rolled her eyes, muttered something about people knowing their place, and made me feel like I was stealing something that wasn't mine. Danielle's voice wavered, but she pressed on. I felt small, humiliated, like I didn't deserve to be there. A ripple of sympathy passed through the room. Maya's heart clenched. "Thank you, Danielle," Elena said softly. "You were brave to come here." Next, Jamal Thompson stepped up, his tall frame rigid with controlled anger. "I've worked as an engineer for Green Tech for 5 years," he began. "I've designed projects, led teams, but every time I travel for work, my credentials are questioned, my ticket is scrutinized, and more than once, I've been pulled aside and told I don't look the part for first class." He glared at Paul Harrington. "It's not just the words. It's the way you're made to feel, like you're a suspect, not a professional." Paul's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. Jamal's voice rose. "Oh, I'm tired of being judged by my skin, not my skills. We're here because enough is enough." Applause broke out, subdued but sincere. Judge Caldwell banged his gavel for order. More testimonies followed. Each story was a crack in the wall of silence that had protected the guilty. Aiden Park spoke of promotions denied. Elena Martinez described the sting of public humiliation. Their voices were clear, their pain undeniable. Jessica's composure crumbled. Tears welled in her eyes. Paul's defiance faltered, beads of sweat forming on his brow. Maya watched, feeling the tide beginning to turn. As the final testimony concluded, Judge Caldwell's voice rang out. "This hearing is far from over. The evidence is compelling, but we have yet to hear from those accused." He turned to Paul and Jessica. "Are you prepared to speak?" Paul's eyes blazed, but his voice was trapped in his throat. Jessica looked away, her shoulders trembling. The room held its breath, the weight of the truth pressing down on everyone. Maya knew that the reckoning had only just begun. The air in the hearing room was thick with tension, the weight of unspoken words pressing against everyone's chest. The rows of spectators, employees, customers, journalists, were silent, their faces reflecting a mixture of anticipation, curiosity, and dread. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the response of the two people whose actions had been thrust into the unforgiving light. At the center of it all sat Paul Harrington and Jessica Monroe. They were no longer merely employees of Green Tech Horizons. They were now symbols of a system exposed, forced to reckon with the consequences of their actions. Judge Ethan Caldwell's voice rang out once more, crisp and commanding. "Mr. Harrington, Miss Monroe, you have both heard the testimonies against you. You now have the opportunity to speak. Do you wish to respond?" Paul Harrington sat, with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw clenched so hard it looked as if his teeth might shatter. His eyes, cold and unyielding, scanned the room with contempt. He leaned into his microphone, his voice a low growl. "This is ridiculous," Paul said, his words dripping with disdain. "I've worked in this company for over 20 years. I've always followed the rules, always maintained standards, and now I'm being made out to be some kind of villain?" A murmur of unease swept through the audience. Michael Trent, seated beside Maya, scribbled a note. "Watch for deflection tactics." Paul continued, his voice rising. "These so-called complaints are exaggerated. People are too sensitive these days. They expect to be coddled, to be treated like royalty, just because they bought a ticket. I did my job. I upheld the company's standards for first-class service." Maya felt her jaw tighten, a hot anger bubbling beneath her composed exterior. "He still doesn't get it." "Mr. Harrington," Judge Caldwell interjected, his voice firm. "The issue here is not the standards of service, but the manner in which you applied them. Multiple witnesses have described being singled out, humiliated, and mistreated. Do you deny these allegations?" Paul's lips curled into a sneer. "I did what needed to be done. If people felt uncomfortable, that's their problem, not mine." A gasp rippled through the room. Maya's stomach churned. His refusal to acknowledge the harm he caused was a slap in the face to every person who had come forward. All eyes turned to Jessica Monroe. Unlike Paul, she looked small and fragile in her chair, her fingers nervously twisting a tissue in her lap. Her eyes darted around the room, landing briefly on Maya before she quickly looked away. "Ms. Monroe," Judge Caldwell prompted gently, "do you wish to respond?" Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." Her words were almost swallowed by the silence. She cleared her throat, her voice shaking. I thought I was just doing my job. I thought I was upholding the rules. Maya watched as tears pooled in Jessica's eyes, her shoulders trembling. For the first time, it seemed as though the weight of her actions was crashing down on her. But when I hear these stories, Jessica continued, her voice breaking, I realized that I wasn't fair. I judged people based on how they looked, how they dressed. I didn't see them as individuals. And I'm so sorry. Her words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. But they were too little, too late. Michael Trent rose from his seat, his expression a careful mask of professionalism. He approached the panel where Paul and Jessica sat, his footsteps echoing in the tense silence. Mr. Harrington, Michael began, his voice calm. You say you were just following the rules. Can you clarify what those rules were? Paul's eyes narrowed. First class is for people who meet a certain standard. It's about maintaining an atmosphere of professionalism and quality. And who decides who meets that standard? Michael asked, his tone deceptively mild. Paul's gaze hardened. People who look like they belong. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Maya felt a chill run down her spine. There it is, she thought. The ugly truth, laid bare. Mr. Harrington, Michael pressed, are you suggesting that people's appearance, specifically their race, their background, determines their worthiness for first-class service? Paul's jaw clenched, his silence louder than any words. Michael turned to Jessica. Ms. Monroe, you mentioned that you thought you were just doing your job. Did you ever question the way you treated certain passengers? Jessica's lower lip quivered. Number, I didn't think about it. I just followed what I thought was expected. Michael's voice softened. And now that you've heard the impact of your actions, do you think that expectation was fair? Jessica's tears spilled over. Number. It wasn't fair. The hearing room felt like a pressure cooker, the tension ready to explode. The crowd, once a sea of hushed voices, was now a storm of murmurs and glances. Some looked outraged, others saddened. But no one remained unmoved. Maya stood, her heart pounding. This was the moment she had been fighting for. The moment when the truth could no longer be denied. She stepped to the microphone, her voice clear and resolute. This isn't just about two employees, Maya said, her gaze sweeping the room. It's about a culture that allowed this behavior to thrive. We failed to stop it. We failed to protect those who trusted us. Her voice trembled with emotion. But we can do better. We must do better. Judge Caldwell's gavel struck the sound block. We will reconvene tomorrow to determine the consequences and next steps. As the crowd began to disperse, Maya felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The hardest part was yet to come. But for now, the silence had been broken, and the truth had finally been spoken. Tomorrow, the reckoning would be complete. The hearing room was alive with a static energy, an electric undercurrent that pulsed through every whispered conversation and every flickering glance. The truth had been exposed, but now the consequences had to be confronted. The day of reckoning had begun. And for Paul Harrington and Jessica Monroe, the walls they had built around themselves were about to collapse. Maya Jennings sat at the head of the table, her presence commanding but calm. Her mind was a whirlpool of thoughts and emotions. The testimonies had shaken everyone to the core. The evidence was irrefutable, the pain undeniable. There was no turning back now. The only path forward was through accountability and transformation. Judge Ethan Caldwell cleared his throat, bringing the room to silence. His gaze swept across the assembled crowd, lingering for a moment on Paul and Jessica. The weight of his judgment felt like an anvil suspended in mid-air, ready to drop. This hearing will now proceed with the examination of the evidence and the determination of consequences, Judge Caldwell announced. His voice was firm, unwavering. Mr. Harrington, Ms. Monroe, you have had the opportunity to speak. Now, we will hear from those who have been wronged. The first to stand was Aiden Park, a young Korean-American engineer who had worked tirelessly for Greentech Horizons for years. He walked to the microphone, his back straight, his eyes blazing with a quiet determination. Mr. Harrington, Aiden began, his voice measured but sharp. I remember the day I was upgraded to first class for a project I had led. You looked at me like I didn't belong. You questioned my ticket, my credentials, my very right to be there. I'd worked nights and weekends, poured everything I had into that project, and yet you made me feel like none of it mattered. Aiden's voice cracked slightly, but he continued. You didn't see an engineer. You saw someone who didn't fit your mold of what a first-class passenger should look like. And that hurt more than I can explain. Paul's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He was beginning to realize the depth of the harm he had caused, but pride held his tongue. Next came Elena Martinez, a Latina customer who had experienced Jessica's condescension firsthand. Her eyes were filled with tears, but her voice was steady. Miss Monroe, Elena said softly, I asked you for help with my luggage. You looked me up and down, sneered, and told me people like me shouldn't carry so much. I was humiliated. I felt small, like I was less than human. Jessica's shoulders shook with silent sobs. Her eyes were red and swollen, and her guilt was etched into every line of her face. Elena's gaze softened. I don't know if you understand how much damage a few careless words can cause, but I hope you will now. As each testimony piled on, the pressure on Paul and Jessica grew unbearable. The weight of the stories, the pain, the sheer injustice, they were like sledgehammers chipping away at their defenses. The walls they had built of denial and self-righteousness began to crumble. Paul's hands shook. He clenched and unclenched his fists, his knuckles white. The stoic facade he had maintained for so long was cracking, and the raw, vulnerable man beneath was being exposed. Jessica's tears flowed freely now. Her body trembled, as if the weight of her guilt was physically crushing her. She couldn't look at the people she had wronged. She couldn't look at herself. Maya watched them carefully. Part of her wanted to feel satisfaction, to see justice finally being served. But all she felt was sadness, a profound, aching grief for the damage that prejudice and ignorance could cause. Judge Caldwell's voice broke through the tension. Mr. Harrington, Ms. Monroe, do you have anything further to say? Paul's eyes flickered with something that looked like regret, but his pride still held firm. He stood, his voice strained. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, he muttered. I was just doing my job. Maya's heart sank. Even now he couldn't fully admit his wrongdoing. But then, just as she was about to give up hope, his shoulders slumped. His voice dropped to a whisper. But maybe I was wrong. The room was silent. It wasn't a full admission, but it was a crack in the wall, a small fissure of vulnerability that could, with time, grow into something more. Jessica, sobbing openly now, clutched the microphone. I was wrong, she choked out. I see that now. I let my own insecurities and prejudices control me, and I hurt people. I can't undo what I did, but I'm sorry, truly sorry. Her words hung in the air, fragile and raw. The room held its breath. Maya stood, her voice clear and resolute. Apologies are a start, but they're not enough. We need action. We need change. and we need accountability. She turned to Judge Caldwell. Your Honor, I propose that Mr. Harrington and Ms. Monroe undergo mandatory diversity and empathy training. They need to confront their biases head-on, and they need to face the people they hurt. Judge Caldwell nodded slowly. That seems appropriate. In addition, they will be placed on probation. Their conduct will be closely monitored. If they fail to change, further consequences will follow. He banged his gavel. This hearing is adjourned. As the crowd began to disperse, Maya felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The hardest part was still ahead. Changing a culture of prejudice wasn't easy. But for now, the walls had started to crumble, and she was ready to rebuild. The sound of Judge Caldwell's gavel still echoed in the minds of everyone who had attended the hearing. It was a decisive blow, one that cracked the foundation of prejudice and called for justice to begin its slow, arduous rebuilding. But the end of the hearing was merely the beginning of a deeper journey, a journey toward redemption, growth, and healing. For Paul Harrington and Jessica Monroe, the walls of denial had finally shattered, leaving them exposed, vulnerable, and unsure of the path ahead. For Maya Jennings, this was the moment to prove that true reform wasn't just a matter of policies and punishments. It was a matter of transforming hearts and minds. The morning after the hearing, the air at Green Tech Horizons felt different. The usual hum of computers, ringing phones, and chatter was subdued. There was a quiet unease, a collective sense that the company stood at a crossroads. Everyone knew what had happened. The hearing had laid bare the company's flaws for all to see. Now they were waiting to see if those wounds could be healed. Maya sat in her office, sunlight streaming through the windows. She stared out at the city skyline, her thoughts a swirling mix of hope, fear, and determination. The reforms she was about to implement weren't just a corporate policy. They were a declaration of the company's soul. It was a commitment to doing better, to being better. A knock at her door broke her reverie. Come in. Elena Rivera entered, her expression resolute. We're ready to begin the training sessions. Maya nodded, standing up. Let's do this. The company's main conference hall was packed. Rows of chairs were filled with employees of all levels, executives in tailored suits, engineers in jeans and polo shirts, service staff in uniforms. The room buzzed with a mixture of skepticism, curiosity, and silent anticipation. Paul Harrington and Jessica Monroe sat in the front row, their faces drawn and somber. They were no longer the figures of authority they had once been. Now, they were students, required to learn lessons they had long ignored. At the front of the room stood Dr. Cynthia Rhodes, a renowned diversity and inclusion expert. She was a tall, graceful woman with a calm, commanding presence. Her eyes swept the room, taking in the sea of faces. Welcome, she said, her voice even and warm. Today marks the first step in a journey toward understanding, empathy, and change. This training is not about punishment. It's about growth. It's about facing the uncomfortable truths within ourselves and choosing to do better. She paused, letting her words settle. Change begins when we confront our biases, and change requires courage. Dr. Rhodes turned to Paul and Jessica. I want to acknowledge the courage it takes to be here today. You've both made mistakes. But what matters now is your willingness to learn, to change, and to make amends. Paul shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. Jessica stared at her hands, her eyes glistening. They felt the weight of every gaze in the room. Let's begin, Dr. Rhodes said. The first exercise was deceptively simple. Each participant was assigned a role different from their own background. Paul found himself cast as a young black man, applying for a job in a predominantly white firm. Jessica was assigned the role of a Latina single mother trying to secure a loan from a dismissive bank officer. They were given scenarios and asked to navigate them as their assigned characters. Paul's scenario began. He approached a table where David Kim, a young Asian American employee, played the role of the hiring manager. "Hello," Paul said, his voice hesitant. David glanced up, his expression cold and disinterested. "Name?" Marcus Thompson." David's eyes flicked over Paul's modest clothing. "Do you have a resume?" Paul handed over the paper, his fingers trembling slightly. David barely glanced at it before setting it aside. "We'll be in touch," David said dismissively, already looking at his phone. "But I haven't even—" "I said we'll be in touch." Paul felt a flush of anger and shame. His mouth went dry. He wanted to protest, to demand respect, but the words died in his throat. He suddenly understood how it felt to be judged before you even opened your mouth. Meanwhile, Jessica was seated across from Maria Sanchez, playing the role of the bank officer. Jessica took a deep breath. "I'd like to apply for a small business loan." Maria raised an eyebrow. "Do you have any collateral?" "No, but I have a solid business plan and—" Maria cut her off with a sigh. "I'm not sure someone in your situation can handle the financial responsibility." Jessica's cheeks burned. "What do you mean by my situation?" Maria shrugged. "You know what I mean." Jessica's eyes stung with tears. The weight of dismissal, the sting of being judged unworthy. It was suffocating, and it was a feeling she had inflicted on others. After the exercises, the room was quiet. The discomfort was palpable. Dr. Rhodes stepped forward. "Now, let's talk about what you felt," she said gently. "Paul, how did it feel to be dismissed without a chance?" Paul's voice was rough. "It felt humiliating, like I didn't matter." Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. "It felt like I was invisible." Dr. Rhodes nodded. "That feeling, that sense of being devalued, is what many people face every day. And it's what your actions have made others feel." Paul's eyes met Maya's across the room. For the first time, she saw genuine remorse flicker in his gaze. "I didn't realize," he said hoarsely. "I didn't know it felt like that." "But now you do," Maya said softly. "The question is, what will you do with that knowledge?" The session ended, but the journey was just beginning. Paul and Jessica walked out of the conference hall, the weight of their experiences heavy on their shoulders. The path to redemption stretched before them, uncertain, difficult, but necessary. For Maya, the road ahead was clearer than ever. Change was possible, healing was within reach, but only if everyone was willing to walk the path together. The glow of the morning sun filtered through the glass facade of GreenTech Horizons, casting long golden streaks across the marble floor. The building, once a silent monument to innovation, now hummed with the quiet murmur of change. Yet beneath that hum was a discordant note, a subtle but unmistakable resistance. Change was never easy, and Maya Jennings knew this. Standing in the central atrium, Maya took a deep breath. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished glass doors, the lines of determination etched deeper into her face. The reform was underway, but the path forward was tangled with skepticism, fear, and defiance. She adjusted her blazer, squared her shoulders, and turned to Elena Rivera, who was reviewing a tablet with a list of employees scheduled for the next diversity workshop. "They're already grumbling," Elena said, her voice low. "Some of the senior staff think this is a waste of time. They don't see why they need to change." Maya's jaw tightened. "Then they haven't learned anything." Elena nodded. "I know. But change terrifies people. They'd rather cling to what they know, even if it's flawed. Maya's eyes hardened. Then, we'll have to show them why it's necessary. The first workshop of the day was held in the executive conference room, a sleek space with a long mahogany table, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a panoramic view of the city. The participants were senior managers and team leaders, the people who shaped the culture of the company. Maya walked in with Elena and Michael Trent, her legal advisor and trusted ally. The room was filled with strained smiles and guarded expressions. Some looked at their watches, others avoided her gaze altogether. "Good morning," Maya said, her voice firm but welcoming. "Thank you for being here." A few nodded politely. Richard Caldwell, the head of operations, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest. His expression was a mix of boredom and disdain. "Let's get started," Maya said, refusing to be intimidated. "We're here because the culture at GreenTech Horizons needs to change. We've seen the consequences of ignoring prejudice. We've felt the damage it causes, not just to individuals, but to the entire company." Richard's eyes narrowed. "With all due respect, Maya, I think we're overreacting. What happened with Harrington and Monroe was unfortunate, but it doesn't mean the whole company is broken." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Maya's heart pounded, but her voice remained steady. "Richard," she said calmly, "ignoring a problem doesn't make it go away. It festers. It spreads. The hearing didn't reveal isolated incidents. It revealed a pattern. And that pattern exists because we let it." Richard's lips tightened. "I've been here for 15 years. We've always had high standards. If people feel slighted, maybe they just need to toughen up." Elena stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "High standards shouldn't come at the cost of dignity. Respect isn't a privilege, it's a right." The room fell silent. Richard's face flushed, but he said nothing. Michael cleared his throat. "We're not here to assign blame. We're here to understand, to grow. Let's try something." He handed out cards to each participant. "Write down the first 3 words that come to mind when you think of a leader at this company." Pens scratched paper. When they were done, Michael collected the cards and read them aloud. "Driven, professional, confident," he read. "Good traits. But now, let's look closer." He held up one card. "White, male, assertive." A hush fell over the room. Here's another. "Well-dressed, authoritative, American-born." Faces paled. Eyes darted around, looking for someone to blame. "This," Michael said, his voice steady, "is the bias we're talking about. It's unconscious, but it's there. And it affects every decision we make, every interaction we have." Richard's voice was tight. "So, what are we supposed to do? Change how we think overnight?" "No," Maya said. "But we have to start questioning those thoughts, challenging them. We have to be willing to see the world through someone else's eyes." The workshop continued with exercises designed to reveal hidden biases. Each activity peeled back layers of defensiveness, exposing raw, uncomfortable truths. At one point, a young black engineer named Jamal Harris stood up. His voice shook, but his eyes were steady. "I've been with GreenTech for 5 years," he said. "I've led projects, mentored interns, and brought in clients. But every time I walk into a meeting, someone asks if I'm the new guy, or if I'm in the wrong room." His gaze landed on Richard. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking to be seen for who I am, not what you assume I am." Richard's jaw worked silently. He looked down at the table, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm. The walls of resistance were cracking. At the end of the workshop, Maya stood at the front of the room. The air was heavy, but something had shifted. The defensiveness had softened into something more pliable, a tentative willingness to change. "I know this isn't easy," she said. "Change never is. But if we want green tech to be a place where everyone feels valued, we have to do the work. Together." She looked around the room, her eyes meeting each pair of eyes, searching for understanding. Richard cleared his throat. His voice was low, hesitant. I'll try. That's all I can promise." Maya nodded. "That's a start." As the participants filed out, Maya felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead was long, the resistance still real. But resolve was building. The seeds of change had been planted. Now, they needed to be nurtured, and Maya was ready. The winds of change swept through green tech horizons like an early spring breeze, gentle in some corners, but a full-force gale in others. The seeds Maya Jennings had planted were beginning to sprout. But transformation was not a sudden bloom. It was a gradual, delicate process. A month had passed since the workshops began. Each day brought new challenges, new revelations, and new opportunities for growth. Some employees embraced the change with open arms, their eyes alight with hope and enthusiasm. Others resisted, their skepticism like iron walls that refused to yield. But one thing was certain: the company was no longer the same. Maya's morning routine had shifted. She now made a point to walk through the office, stopping to greet employees she might not have interacted with before. Her once brisk, laser-focused pace had softened. She listened, she observed, and she encouraged others to do the same. As she passed the marketing department, she caught a glimpse of Jessica Monroe in a team huddle. Jessica's face was still lined with traces of guilt, but there was a new determination in her eyes. She was listening intently to a younger colleague, a woman of Indian descent named Priya Patel. Jessica nodded and smiled, her tone genuine. "That's a great idea, Priya. Let's run with it." Priya's face lit up, her confidence blooming like a flower in sunlight. For once, her ideas weren't being dismissed or sidelined. She felt heard, seen. Maya's heart swelled with cautious optimism. This was how change happened, not in grand gestures, but in small, meaningful moments. In the break room, a new bulletin board displayed stories from employees. It was titled Voices of Green Tech. Each week, a new story was pinned to the board. Personal experiences of overcoming bias, stories of teamwork, tales of resilience. David Kim, a lead software engineer, had shared a story about his parents immigrating from South Korea and the struggles they faced. His note read, "I used to hide parts of myself at work, afraid that being different would hold me back. But now I realize that those differences make me stronger. They make us all stronger." Next to his story was one from Elena Rivera, recounting her experience as a Latina woman in a leadership role. "I once thought I had to be twice as tough to prove myself. But toughness doesn't mean shutting people out. It means standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." Employees paused to read these stories, their expressions shifting from curiosity to understanding. Conversations sparked. Walls of ignorance began to crumble. A culture of empathy and respect was beginning to take root. Meanwhile, Jessica Monroe and Paul Harrington were deep in the trenches of their redemption journey. Their mandated diversity training sessions were grueling, emotional, and unrelenting. In one session, Jessica sat opposite Marcus Green, a black project manager who had been on the receiving end of her condescension more than once. His eyes were wary, his arms crossed. "I don't know if I can trust you, Jessica," Marcus said bluntly. "Words are cheap." Jessica's throat tightened. The old defensiveness threatened to rise, but she pushed it down. "I understand," she said softly. "I don't expect you to trust me overnight, but I'm here, and I'm trying. That's all I can do for now. Marcus studied her for a long moment. Then, keep trying. Paul's path was rockier. His resentment had calcified over years of unexamined bias. But each session chipped away at that stubborn exterior. In a role-playing exercise, he found himself playing a young immigrant engineer, presenting an idea to a dismissive boss. His voice faltered as the boss shot down his idea with a sneer. He felt the sting of dismissal, the gut-wrenching frustration of being judged unfairly. After the exercise, Paul sat in silence, his hands clenched into fists. "Now you understand," Maya said gently, watching him. "This is what others felt, because of your actions." Paul's eyes were damp, his voice rough. "I didn't know how much it hurt." "But now you do," Maya replied. "What you do with that knowledge is up to you." To support the cultural shift, Maya and her leadership team implemented concrete changes. Anonymous feedback channels. Employees could now report incidents of bias or discrimination without fear of retaliation. Diversity metrics. Teams were evaluated not just on performance, but on how well they fostered inclusion and collaboration. Mentorship programs. Senior employees were paired with younger, diverse talent, creating opportunities for growth and understanding. Regular workshops. Monthly sessions continued to address topics like unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, and empathy. The changes weren't perfect, and they weren't always welcomed. But they were necessary, and slowly they were making a difference. Word of GreenTech's transformation began to spread beyond the company walls. Industry leaders took notice. Journalists reached out for interviews. Maya was invited to speak at panels and conferences about the importance of equity in corporate culture. At one conference, Maya stood before a packed auditorium. The lights were blinding, the silence heavy with expectation. She took a deep breath and began. "Change is hard," she said. "It's messy. It's uncomfortable. But it's also necessary. We've seen what happens when we ignore prejudice. We've seen the damage it causes. At GreenTech, we chose to face it head-on. And we're still learning, still growing." Her eyes scanned the audience. But growth isn't just for one company. It's for all of us. Imagine what we could achieve if every workplace, every industry, committed to fairness and respect. Imagine the innovation, the collaboration, the possibilities. The applause was thunderous, but Maya knew the real work was back at GreenTech, where change was still unfolding, one step at a time. Back at the office, Maya received an unexpected email. It was from the international partner she had lost after the incident on the train. Subject: "Let's talk again." Her heart leapt. Maybe, just maybe, the world was ready to meet her halfway. The auditorium at the Global Innovators Conference in New York City buzzed with anticipation. Industry titans, tech entrepreneurs, journalists, and corporate leaders filled the grand hall. Banners celebrating diversity, equity, and innovation hung from the vaulted ceilings, shimmering in the soft light. Maya Jennings stood backstage, her hands clasped tightly. The nerves she thought she'd overcome years ago were back, dancing along her spine. But this wasn't the same fear she had faced when starting her company. This was different. This was the weight of a message that had the potential to reshape industries. Elena Rivera placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've got this, Maya. This isn't just about GreenTech anymore. It's about setting a new standard for everyone." Maya exhaled slowly. "You're right. This is bigger than us." The announcer's voice boomed over the speakers. "Please, welcome to the stage, CEO of GreenTech Horizons, Maya Jennings." A wave of applause rolled through the hall as Maya walked out, her heels clicking softly on the polished wood. She paused for a moment at the podium, letting the applause die down, scanning the sea of faces, watching her with curiosity, expectation, and in some cases skepticism. "Good morning," Maya began, her voice steady and clear. "I stand before you today, not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who has learned a lot from facing the hard questions." She paused, allowing her words to settle. When Green Tech Horizons first faced a reckoning with our own culture of bias and prejudice, the easiest thing to do would have been to sweep it under the rug, to issue a quick apology, make superficial changes, and move on. But we didn't. We couldn't. The room was silent now, each word drawing them in closer. We chose to face the truth. We chose to confront the prejudice that had taken root, not just in individuals, but in the very systems and structures we had built. It was painful. It was humbling, but it was necessary. Maya's eyes met those of a young woman in the front row, her expression one of quiet hope. What we learned was that diversity isn't just a box to check. Inclusion isn't just a buzzword. These values are the lifeblood of innovation. They are the keys to unlocking the full potential of our teams, our companies, and our industries. She took a breath, her voice rising with conviction. Imagine a workplace where every idea is heard, every talent is nurtured, and every individual feels they belong. Imagine the breakthroughs we could achieve, the problems we could solve, the futures we could build. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. We at Green Tech are still on this journey. We've stumbled, we've fallen, but each time we've risen stronger. And we're not stopping. Maya looked out over the audience, her gaze unwavering. I invite all of you to join us, to look at your own companies, your own teams, and ask, are we doing enough? Are we fostering a culture where everyone can thrive? She paused, the silence thick with possibility. Change isn't easy, but it is worth it. For our employees, for our customers, for our future. The applause began slowly, then swelled to a roar. Some people rose to their feet, clapping, their eyes shining with inspiration. Maya's heart swelled. This was why she fought. This was why she wouldn't give up. As Maya stepped off the stage, she was immediately surrounded by people. Derek Thompson, the CEO of a major tech firm, extended his hand. That was powerful, Maya. We've been wrestling with similar issues. Maybe it's time we take a closer look. Chloe Martinez, a journalist from Tech World magazine, smiled. I want to write a feature on Green Tech's journey. Companies need to hear this. Maya shook their hands, feeling a surge of hope. The message was spreading. The ripples of change were extending beyond Green Tech's walls. As the conference continued, discussions about diversity and inclusion took center stage. Panels on equitable hiring practices, unconscious bias, and inclusive leadership drew standing-room-only crowds. Executives exchanged ideas, swapped stories, and, for the first time, spoke openly about the challenges they faced. Later that evening, Maya's phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced down and saw an email from Hiroshi Tanaka, the CEO of Tanaka Global Innovations, the international partner she had lost after the incident on the train. Subject: Let's talk again. Body: Dear Ms. Jennings, I watched your speech today. It moved me deeply. We were too quick to walk away before. Your commitment to change, to fairness, and to integrity is exactly what we want in a partner. Let's revisit our collaboration. I believe we can achieve great things together. Sincerely, Hiroshi Tanaka. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She read the email again, hardly believing it. The deal that had slipped through her fingers, the opportunity that had felt lost forever, was back. Because of the truth, because of the work, because of the willingness to change. She forwarded the email to Elena with a simple message: "We did it." Back at GreenTech Horizons, the news spread like wildfire. The partnership with Tanaka Global was back on. Employees who had once doubted the reforms now saw their impact. The company wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. In a celebratory meeting, Maya stood before her team. The room was filled with smiles, laughter, and a renewed sense of purpose. "We faced our demons," she said, her voice warm. "We chose to change. And because of that, we're not just a better company, we're a better family." Cheers erupted, echoing off the walls. As the meeting ended, Maya lingered for a moment, watching her team. The road had been long and hard, but the destination was worth it. Elena approached, a knowing smile on her face. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" Maya nodded, her eyes shining. "Yes, and I can't wait to see where we go next." In her heart, she knew the journey toward fairness and inclusion was never truly over. But for the first time, she felt ready for whatever came next. The conference hall at GreenTech Horizons was alive with anticipation. Employees, senior leaders, partners, and clients filled the space, their eyes bright with curiosity and hope. Today marked the final company meeting of the year, a year defined by transformation, resilience, and hard-fought progress. The air shimmered with the weight of what had been achieved and the promise of what was still to come. At the front of the room, a large screen displayed a simple but powerful message in bold letters. "We are GreenTech, building a legacy of fairness." Maya Jennings stood by the podium, her heart a steady drumbeat in her chest. She took a moment to look around, letting the sight of her team fill her with a profound sense of fulfillment. Each face held a story. Each person in this room had been part of the journey. They had questioned, resisted, and ultimately embraced the changes that had reshaped their company's soul. This wasn't just another meeting. This was a celebration of a shared commitment to fairness, equity, and respect. And it was just the beginning. Maya took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium. The murmurs in the hall quieted as everyone turned their attention to her. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice warm and clear. "It's hard to believe we've come to the end of this year, a year that has tested us, challenged us, and ultimately transformed us." She paused, scanning the room, making eye contact with the people who had walked this path with her. "We started this year facing hard truths about who we were as a company. We saw prejudice and bias within our walls, things we couldn't ignore. And instead of turning away, we chose to face them. We chose to change. And that choice has made all the difference." A ripple of agreement swept through the room. Heads nodded. Faces reflected pride and determination. "We've implemented new policies, held difficult conversations, and learned to see each other in new ways. It hasn't been easy. Change never is. But it has been worth it." Maya gestured to the screen behind her. "Today, I want us to hear from the people who've made this journey possible, the people who embody the spirit of GreenTech's new legacy." The lights dimmed, and the screen flickered to life. A montage of stories began to play. First was Jessica Monroe, the former first-class train attendant who had once been part of the problem. Her face appeared on the screen, her eyes clear and steady. "When I first faced the truth about my actions, I felt shame. I wanted to hide. But the training and support I received at GreenTech helped me see that change is possible. I've learned to listen, to question my biases, and to treat everyone with the respect they deserve. I'm proud to be part of a company that believes in second chances." The camera cut to Jessica in a workshop, guiding a group of new employees through an empathy exercise. Her voice was confident, her posture strong. She was no longer the same person who had stood in that hearing room months ago. Next was Paul Harrington, the former conductor whose defiance had once been a symbol of resistance to change. His face appeared, lined with humility and resolve. I spent years believing that upholding standards meant keeping people out. I was wrong. True standards are about dignity, fairness, and inclusion. Green Tech gave me a chance to learn that. And now, I'm committed to helping others see it too. The video showed Paul leading a diversity training session, his voice firm but compassionate. He listened intently as employees shared their experiences, his nods and words of encouragement genuine. The montage continued, featuring employees from all walks of life. Priya Patel, the marketing coordinator, whose ideas were now valued and celebrated. Marcus Green, the project manager who had once been sidelined, but was now leading major initiatives. David Kim, the software engineer, who had found pride in his heritage and shared it with his team. Each story was a thread in the tapestry of Green Tech's transformation. Each voice added weight to the company's new legacy. When the montage ended, the room erupted in applause. Maya felt a lump rise in her throat. This was more than she had ever dreamed of. This was proof that change was possible. She smiled and stepped back to the podium. These stories remind us that we're not just building a company. We're building a community, a place where everyone belongs, where everyone can thrive. Maya looked to Elena Rivera and Michael Trent, who stood at the side of the stage. They had been her anchors, her partners in this fight for justice. I couldn't have done this alone, Maya continued. Elena, Michael, and every one of you have made this possible. Your courage, your honesty, and your commitment have brought us to this moment. Elena stepped forward, taking the microphone. Her voice trembled with emotion. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning. We have a responsibility to keep this legacy alive, to keep pushing, questioning, and growing. Michael added, We've set a new standard here at Green Tech. Let's make sure we hold ourselves and each other to it. As the applause settled, Maya took a deep breath. And now, I have one more piece of news to share. The room quieted. A sense of anticipation thickened the air. Green Tech Horizons has officially partnered with Tanaka Global Innovations, Maya announced, her voice ringing with pride. This partnership will allow us to expand our reach, develop new technologies, and continue our mission of creating a fair and sustainable future. The room exploded with cheers. The partnership that had once seemed lost was now a reality. It was more than a business deal. It was a symbol of what Green Tech had become. As the celebration continued, Maya stepped back and took it all in. The laughter, the smiles, the sense of unity. It was everything she had fought for. And yet she knew the work was far from over. Elena joined her, a glass of sparkling water in hand. You did it, Maya. We did it, Maya corrected, clinking her glass with Elena's. But we're not done. Elena grinned. Good. I wouldn't want it any other way. Maya looked out over her team, her heart full. This was the legacy she wanted to leave. A legacy of fairness, respect, and endless possibility. Maya stepped back to the podium one last time. The room quieted, the energy a steady hum. Let's go forward with courage, she said. Let's build a future where fairness isn't a goal. It's a way of life. Together, we can do it. Together, we are Green Tech. The cheers rose again, echoing into the future. A future they would build, hand in hand, step by step. And Maya knew deep in her soul that they were ready. We hope this story resonated with you, sparked some thoughts, or maybe even stirred your heart. What would you have done in Maya's shoes? Have you ever faced a moment where you had to stand your ground or challenge the status quo? We'd love to hear your experiences. Drop a comment below and join the conversation. Your voice matters here. And if you found yourself rooting for Maya, for green tech, or for the power of fairness and change, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We've got more stories of courage, resilience, and transformation coming your way. Together, let's keep exploring what it means to stand up for what's right. See you in the next story.